Hi, my name's Simon Jones, and this is a talk I did at Writers' Centre Norwich last weekend, all about online serialisation, and I figured it would be good to put it out as a webinar as well. So they asked me to do a talk on digital publishing, but this was part of a day which was taking in all kinds of different forms of publishing, some traditional, some digital. And the specific type of digital publishing that I was really focusing on was, in fact, online serialisation, which is something I've been doing for a few years now and is basically the main way I write my fiction these days. Okay, so towards the end of last year, I was in Agilis, which is an Eritrean restaurant in London. It does extremely tasty food, such as injera, which is a delicious Eritrean dish, which is almost impossible to take a nice photo of. While I was there, I got a notification on my phone letting me know that I'd actually won an award, a Wattie Award. This was kind of a big deal because the Wattie Awards are run by Wattpad.com and they claim that they're the biggest online writing competition in the world. I don't know if that's true or not, but they have over 100,000 entries per year. So regardless, it was very exciting to kind of get to the top and win in the Trailblazer category for my novel A Day of Faces, which is what I've been publishing on Wattpad for the previous couple of years. And winning an award was surprising, not least because if you go back 10 years or so, I wasn't really doing anything that would put me in a position to win an award for my writing. I was in the visual effects software industry and was doing a lot of creative projects, but mostly to do with short films and nothing to do with writing creative fiction. And that in itself is also a bit strange because if you go back another 10 years, actually all I was really doing was writing. I was writing poems, short stories, novellas. I was writing my own sequels to my favorite novels and movies, because that's the kind of thing you do as a teenager when you have far too much time on your hands. And really, a lot of what I'm talking about here is actually all to do with time, because when I was a teenager, I had far too much of it. And then as you get older, other things start to take your attention, whether that's family or job or friends or whatever it may be. You know, other things become important in your life, and that's fine, that's healthy. But it means you have less time to spend doing your creative passions and your pursuits, and figuring out that balance can be really hard. And for me, in the mid 2000s, an entire industry of distractions suddenly appeared as well. And that was pretty tricky to try and navigate. I'm sure some of you feel a similar way. And then in 2012, the biggest distraction of all arrived. His name's Yared, and he continues to be something of a distraction, which is wonderful. But when he was born, I realized that I was never going to have a time in my life when I would have more time. There wasn't going to be some magical later on when I'd get all that time back that I used to have as a teenager. And also, looking at this newborn gave me this weird sense of my own mortality. It kind of emphasized the fact that I was getting older. You know, I was in my 30s and I was no longer a teenager or even in my 20s when I didn't really think about that kind of stuff. And I realized that I was, at some point, going to die. And it meant that really I couldn't just keep leaving things until later on. This guy is Reginald Kurtlitz, and he's my great uncle. And his family motto was Nil sine labore. I'm not sure if I said that correctly, but what it means is nothing without labor, i.e. you've got to put some effort in. And he knew what he was talking about because he went to the Antarctica on the Discovery with Captain Scott. That was the mission where they didn't all die, which was good. The reason this is pertinent is that in his late 60s, my dad decided he was going to write a biography of this guy. My dad had been in the police for 30 years and had never had any kind of ambitions to become a writer, but he loved this guy's story. He was frustrated that it wasn't one that had been told. And so he wrote the book, he finished the book, and he got it published through a small press. And this made me realize that I needed to get on with it because my dad, who had never particularly wanted to be a writer, had become a published writer long before me. It was me, the guy who had claimed to always want to be a writer when he was growing up. And so what I realized is that I had to do things a bit differently because my problem wasn't doing the writing. I was always writing and dabbling with this and that, whether that be short stories or comics or audio dramas, whatever it may be. I had manuscripts filling up hard drives, half finished, never quite completed. And the reason for that is that the next project is always more interesting. So I would be writing, working away on something, and then a new idea would pop into my head. And I'd think, oh, I better go and investigate that. I'll go and prod that for a little bit and see where it takes me. I'll come back to this later on. And of course, you never go back to that project, and it becomes another half-finished thing sitting on a hard drive somewhere. So really what this meant was that I needed to figure out a different way of doing my writing. It wasn't about the quality of my writing at that point, it was simply getting it done. And that led me to the Pickwick Papers, which was first published in 1836. Except it's not so much the book specifically, but the way it was released. So before it was a single book, which is how we think of it now, it actually went out as a 19-issue serialization over 20 months. And serializing fictional work like this was pretty common back then. Lots of the novels that we consider classic works of literature actually first existed in this form. But then as the 20th century rolled around, serialization and the notion of episodic storytelling kind of segued into being something that radio and TV did. And books and literature went long form. But then towards the end of the 20th century, something changed again. The internet was invented. Now, like I mentioned earlier, it brought with it a whole load of distractions, but really, as long as you can deal with that, it actually is just a mass of incredibly exciting opportunities, particularly for creative people. So when you marry serialization as a concept with the internet, it's the perfect combination. Filmmakers have discovered this through YouTube. You know, as a filmmaker before, if you didn't get a studio to back your feature film and put it into cinemas, what were you going to do? You might be able to put a short film into a film festival, but hardly anyone goes to a film festival compared to a general cinema going audience. These days, you make a short film, you can stick it on YouTube or Vimeo, and you can have hundreds of thousands of people watch that short film. That's a really amazing thing. Same goes for producers of audio content with podcasts, SoundCloud. Journalists have seen their entire industry turned upside down by blogging, you know, in good ways and bad ways, depending on your point of view. It's probably a bit of both. And for creative writers, you've got things like Wattpad. So this is what I've been using for the last few years. It's essentially YouTube for words, and that brings with it all the good and bad connotations you might have. So it's free to write on it, it's free to read on it. Anyone can use it. It has something like 45 million readers, I believe. It's a huge platform, especially in some territories, and it's built around serialization and episodic content. So you put your work up chapter by chapter. When you put a new chapter up, it notifies anyone that's reading the book and they read the next part. And there's a lot of rubbish on Wattpad, just like there's a lot of rubbish on YouTube, but there's also incredibly good stuff on there as well. You just need to know how to find it. And so I use this to write A Day of Faces, which was a book that turned out to be 60 chapters long. I published it over 60 weeks, one chapter a week. It's kind of equivalent to about a 450-page novel if you were to print it in a traditional fashion. Those 60 chapters cumulatively have amassed over 121,000 reads. If you drill that down into actually unique readers, it's about 25,000 unique readers. And of those, 1,500 actually got to the end. That's the kind of granular insight you can get into your work when you publish in this kind of manner. And so those numbers are all incredibly exciting for me. It's great and it's really affirming. But the most important thing really is that I wrote this book and I finished it, I published it, and people have read it. And that's what separates it from everything else I've ever done, which is that I actually finished it and put it out there. It didn't just languish on a hard drive in a half-finished form. And I also managed to do this in a way that didn't get in the way of the rest of my life. And in fact, it felt fairly easy to do it. And a lot of this was due to serializing. So rather than it being this monolithic novel project that was incredibly scary and big, I just wrote one chapter a week, and one chapter is pretty easy to do. And then the next thing you know, 60 chapters later, you've kind of accidentally written a book. So I learned a lot while I was doing this. And the key thing really that kind of comes at the start of all this is your right-life balance. Now, what I mean by this is figuring out how much time you can actually commit to your writing. And you want to take into account all the other things that are going on in your life, whether that's your partner, kids, your job, other activities you do outside of work. Figure out all that stuff and then try and determine how much you can dedicate just to your writing. Now, once you've done that, chop 2/3 off it, and what's left is probably what you can actually realistically do. Once I'd done this, it kind of resulted in about one evening's worth of writing, which didn't seem very much, but that was what I could definitely, absolutely, positively do every week without any problems and without pissing off anyone else in my close surroundings. And it's very important to get it right because you're going to be putting up a chapter every week. So you're going to be writing and publishing as you go. And if you get that balance wrong, then you're setting yourself up for a fall down the line because you're not going to be able to keep up with the pace that you set for yourself. And that's going to give you stress. And more than anything else, it's probably going to mean that the project will fail, or at least you'll start missing weeks, and that will frustrate your readers and makes the whole thing really tricky. So with The Day of Faces, I wrote the chapter, proofed it, and published it on the same evening. Every Monday evening I was doing that. And it was kind of hairy. I don't really recommend you actually do it that way. With my novel that I'm serializing at the moment, I'm trying to build in as much buffer between the writing and the publishing so that I have more time to edit, more time to proof, and just generally finesse the novel. And I'm pretty sure that's resulting in it being a higher quality book overall. And so with these chapters, you want to keep them between 1,200 to 2,500 words. And you shorten that and it starts to get a bit insubstantial. It means that your reader hasn't really got anything to get their teeth into. But at the same time, if you go over 2,500 words, it gets hard to consume that chapter in a single sitting. You want people to be able to read it easily over breakfast or at lunch, in their lunch break, on the commute to work. And most importantly, if it gets too long, it's going to start competing with all the other things they could be doing, whether that's reading the latest hardback or paperback they've picked up from the shop, or watching TV, or watching a movie, or playing a game, whatever it is they do. And if you've got to choose between your Wattpad chapter or reading something that's been professionally produced, they're probably going to go for the professional thing. Whereas if you keep your work fairly short and bite-sized, they can do that without it stopping them from doing anything else. So don't try and compete with the A-listers, at least not straight away. Once you've figured this all out, you have to be merciless. So once you've pinpointed how much writing you can do, whether that's an hour or an evening or 2 evenings a week, that thing is sacrosanct. This is almost a religious thing you have to stick to. Doesn't matter if you're ill, doesn't matter if you've had a shitty day at work. None of that really matters. You just have to stick to it and keep going no matter what. Because if you miss a week, not only are you going to confuse your readers, but missing a week means that it's then even easier to miss 2 weeks and then 3 weeks. And then before you know it, the entire project collapses. And you don't want that to happen. And what you're doing really is growing an audience at the same time as growing your book. Because of the way Wattpad works, every chapter is kind of a mini book launch. So when you put out a book in one go, you have your launch weekend or your launch day. If that doesn't quite come off, you're going to get a real hard time getting any kind of momentum behind the work. With serialized publishing, every chapter you put out is a new chance to find readers. So it's constantly refreshing itself. Even if chapter 1 only gets 5 readers, chapter 30 might be getting 1,000 readers. So to make this actually work in a way that isn't incredibly stressful, you do want to have some kind of a plan. Everyone likes to plan to a different degree. I like to keep things fairly fluid, but I always make sure I've got at least 5 to 10 chapters ahead planned out. And this means that I don't write myself into corners or fall into my own plot holes. And it means that when I sit down for that one evening of writing a week that I can definitely do, I already know what I'm going to be writing. I know where the story's going. At the same time, you want to be able to adapt. So I find that my best ideas come along midway through writing. Doesn't matter how much effort I put in at the start, it's only once I start writing that I think of the really good stuff. And you have to have confidence in your abilities so that you can change angle and go down a different path. And to the reader, it looks like that was always the plan. And you do have to commit to your story. So when you're serializing, there's nothing technically stopping you from going back to an earlier chapter and completely changing it. But that's obviously going to be pretty confusing for your readers. Just like if you're watching a TV show and they fall into a plot hole in season 3, you don't expect them to go back to season 1 and re-edit one of the episodes just to get out of that thing that they've written themselves into. And similarly, you have to commit to what you're doing. So when it comes to the big plot twists or killing off a character, you really have to consider it carefully, because once you've done that, you have to stick with that for the rest of your book. So something that comes up again and again these days is that as a writer, you're not just writing your creative work, you're also being a marketer for your finished product. This seems to be the case whether you're being published in a traditional sense or whether you're going through self-publishing, online serialization, whatever. You have to build a platform. You can't just put your work out and expect people to magically come to it. You have to let them know you exist and that your book exists. So this might mean having a blog. It might mean going on social media, setting up Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Reddit, whatever it is. And depending on the type of genre you're working in, the type of book, you want to go to different venues. If you like that genre, chances are you already have a pretty good insight into where those people hang out. And you can innovate as well. So when I was writing on Wattpad, although that was my primary platform, there's nothing stopping me from putting it out in other ways. So every 10 chapters or so, I'd collate them together and put them out as an ebook, because realistically, there will always be some people who just don't want to read on Wattpad, and that's completely fine. So I give them the ebook and they can read it on their Kindle. Maybe I record a narration and put it out as an audiobook through SoundCloud. That way, people who have a long commute and drive to work, they can listen to it on their drive. Give people different options so that they can encounter your work however they want to. And it's all about networking, like pretty much everything else in life. So when you're doing online serialization, you're trying to get the word out, and that can be done through entering competitions, doing little short stories. You can take part in community events like story fairs and block parties. These are all things that put your work and you as a writer in front of readers, and also connects you up with other writers, and you start to build that kind of network. You can go to Wattpad meetups and conventions where you'll meet Wattpad staff and moderators, other authors, and all this kind of helped me lead A Day of Faces towards being featured and then later on winning that Wattie Award. Wattpad is all about a conversation. So in any given morning, I might get a notification on my phone that says that somebody has just read chapter 1 of A Day of Faces and they liked it. And that's a great feeling, that's lovely. But then half an hour later, I get another notification saying they've read chapter 2 and they like that as well. And then throughout the day, I'll get these notifications rolling in, which basically gives me a real-time insight into what people are doing with my book. So as they flow through the text, they're writing comments, they're voting on it, and I know that somewhere, someone in the world is reading my book at that exact moment. And that's incredibly exciting. You don't really get that with anything else, any other kind of form of publishing. You have a sense of sales, you know, the point of sale to some degree. But once someone's got that book, you don't really have any idea if they've actually read it or not, especially with print books, where I think we all have print books that are sitting on our shelves waiting to be read, and you may or may not get around to that one day. And so with these people, you really want to engage with them. You know, if someone votes, say thank you. If somebody leaves a comment, well, if it's a negative comment, have some tact, maybe just leave them to it, unless they've given you some constructive feedback that is genuinely useful, in which case you can thank them for it. If they've given you a nice comment, again, say thanks. And if they've asked you something about the themes or the character or the plot, then you can reply to that and help them have a deeper understanding of your text. It's the kind of experience you get if you attend a convention or a literature festival where you get a Q&A with the author, except when you're writing on Wattpad, you get to have that experience continuously with each individual reader as they go through the book, if you want to anyway. So this all sounds really exciting and utopian, but you do have to be realistic about what you're getting into and what you're going to get out of it, and most particularly what you want from your writing. So why is it that you're writing? You have to be honest with yourself. So with A Day of Faces, I got 121,000 readers as of last week. That's an incredible thing for me. And writing this way is maybe more productive. It's given me legitimacy. It's given me confidence. I'm pretty sure embarking on this online serialization journey in a kind of indirect way helped me get a job in the arts and literature sector and transform my career in that way. And, you know, it's enabled me to be on the panel earlier doing all this talk about publishing, which is what this webinar has come out of. And essentially, the core of it is that it has made me a writer, and that can't be overestimated, really. At the same time, I've made about $60 out of publishing this way. So you can't do online serialization in the expectation it's going to fund your life. This is not a way of becoming a full-time writer. But what it has done for me is it's helped my writer's CV, if you like. So I can now, if I want to go to an agent or a publisher, I can prove that I can conceive of, write, and finish a project. I can get it out to readers, and readers want to read it and they like it. So I'm in a much better position now to demonstrate my writing ability than I was if I hadn't done any of these things. But ultimately, it's always been hard to make money as an artist. But right now, it's never been easier to actually publish your work and find appreciative readers. And ultimately, Wattpad is not a block to doing anything else. So people like these guys, Turan Matharu and Victoria James, they started off on Wattpad, and they've since gone down a traditional publishing route. They've actually taken the work that they started on Wattpad and had it published and printed and sold in bookstores. So they've ended up going that way. So even if your ambitions are towards traditional publishing, then why wait? Go online right now, embrace serialization, start building a readership, and be a writer. There's no reason not to do that right now. So thank you very much for listening and watching. You can find out more about my stuff at my website at simonkjones.com. And of course, you can find out about what the Writers' Centre do over at writerscentrenorwich.org.uk. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.